Hello. Hello and welcome to PHC 101 Paramedic Professionalism and Communication. This is your first lectorial for this subject. My name is Dr. Ruth Townsend. I will be presenting today's session. It is largely a didactic session. That is where I present information to you and you process it, and this is the sort of information that we'll be going over in the tutorials later in the week. So today's lesson is basically an introduction to paramedic professionalism, to give you some idea about who paramedics are, what the profession is, where it's come from, and to allow you to sort of understand the profession that you're hoping to join, and some of the really important aspects of being a professional paramedic. So the objectives of the lesson are to ensure that you have an understanding of the term professionalism, that you understand what it is to be a profession, and to have an understanding of where paramedicine has come from in terms of its professionalisation, how it's gone from being a vocation with largely ambulance drivers or stretcher bearers, all the way through to the highly sophisticated healthcare professionals that they are today, practicing really advanced skills and knowledge. We will talk about the unique role that paramedics play in society, the gap that they fill in the healthcare market, which is really important, and we will consider the development of paramedicine, like I said, as a profession over time, and think about where paramedicine might be heading into the future. So the first place to start is to think about what is a paramedic. So you may have a notion of what you think a paramedic is that may have been informed by various media representations of paramedics, for example. So you may have seen, a television show that really sort of serves to promote the profession in a particular way and sort of take a few of our more glamorous jobs, I would suggest, and promote those. But you may have your idea that paramedics jump out of helicopters, or that they're always working at traumatic scenes. But in reality, the work that paramedics do is much broader than that. We do a lot of just care for the elderly, care for vulnerable people, transport, of course. And in this photo here, you can see a paramedic from Queensland has taken a palliative care patient, a patient who's dying, on the way home from hospital to home to die, and she asked if she could stop and see the ocean one more time, and he did that for her. And that is really what we're striving to achieve here in terms of our development of you as paramedics, is that we hope you will pop out the other end of this program and be practicing like this paramedic is, to really promote the well-being of your patients and put your patients' interests first. And by doing something just as simple as this, which is stopping and letting her look at the ocean for one last time before she goes home to die. So I want you to stop for a minute and sort of think about what you think a paramedic is. The most common identifiers that we have for a paramedic include that they work in an uncontrolled out-of-hospital environment, that they most often provide emergency care in that uncontrolled environment, and this is unique work that no other healthcare worker does. There are no other healthcare workers who, as a group, routinely work outside in an uncontrolled out-of-hospital environment and providing emergency care, or unscheduled care is another way of putting it. Oftentimes paramedics are the first point of call for vulnerable people who are really having a bad day, for their first entry into the healthcare system. Unlike other practitioners, like I mentioned, paramedics are typically responding to unknown situations. They just don't know what it is they're going to when you get a call. It could be anything that you arrive at. And paramedics are traditionally associated with their vehicle. So it's not that the paramedic alone is viewed as a practitioner, but what is often associated with a paramedic is an ambulance, so that it's not just the provision of treatment, it's also the opportunity to transport a patient to further care and treatment that is common amongst paramedics. So these are the most common identifiers for paramedics. There are around 16,000 full-time salaried paramedics in Australia, which isn't a lot. There are, for example, just by comparison, over 100,000 nurses. So we're a relatively small profession. What do you think paramedics do? Why do you want to be a paramedic? What do you think paramedics actually do, now that I've told you that it's not all lights and sirens and trauma? And does this match your expectations? So I want you to stop for a moment and think about that for a second. So what do you think a paramedic is, and what do you think a paramedic does? So moving further than that, beyond what a paramedic is and what a paramedic does, do we know what a profession is? In order for us to sort of define what professionalism is, we really first of all need to understand whether paramedicine is a profession, so that we understand where we've come from and where we're going to in terms of our development as a discipline. So there are numerous people here in this picture: teacher, businessman, waitress, doctor, cook, police, judge, repairman. Which of those do you think is a profession, and why? And once you've answered that question, I want you to give some thought to whether you think a paramedic is a profession or not. So the term profession is a term that's used in the discipline of sociology. And sociology is the discipline that studies society. The word ology means to study, and the word the suffix ology means to study, and the prefix socio is society. So it means to study society. Sociologists look at the way society is structured and the way that it functions. And one of the things that sociologists have identified, of course, is that our society is pretty heavily structured around work. That work is a really big part of our society. And another thing that sociologists have identified is that workers are grouped in a variety of different ways. And one of the ways in which workers are grouped is as professionals and non-professionals. And I suppose there's some debate about the usefulness of that distinction. Does it matter whether we're dealing with a professional or a non-professional? In terms of healthcare, we say yes, there is a distinction, and this distinction is made out in the legislation that regulates healthcare professionals in Australia, so that all the main healthcare professions like medicine and nursing are regulated by a very specific piece of law called the Health Practitioner Regulation National Law Act, which is a mouthful. And what it does is basically, what that piece of law says is that the people who are regulated by it are required to act in a particular way. And the way in which they're required to act is not just to do their job to the best of their ability, like a waitress would or a repairman would, but to also, the distinction is to act in the patient's best interest, to act in the interests of somebody else before yourself. It's not just something that's good for business, it's something that is an obligation of yours under your regulation. It's something that your profession and all the healthcare professions require of other health professionals, is to put the interests of others before yourself. So the repairman might do that. The repairman is like a plumber, for example, might think it's in his best interest to look after his client's best interests. But the difference between the plumber and the paramedic is that there's an obligation on a paramedic to always put their patient's interests first. So there are some characteristics that distinguish a profession from a non-profession that have been recognised in the sociological literature, and they include that the profession serves a unique purpose in our society. And we would say that paramedicine does serve a unique purpose. So it works in that out of hospital, uncontrolled space, providing healthcare in that uncontrolled out of hospital space. So it provides a unique purpose. And when we look through the history of paramedicine in a minute, we'll see that how that's developed, how that gap in the provision of healthcare has been identified and filled over time between hospital and home care. Another characteristic is that the profession has specialised knowledge and skills. This is knowledge and skills that is known by the profession and no one else. It's discrete information. It's just a discrete set of skills. And paramedicine has that discrete knowledge and skills. It's very particular to its discipline that doesn't necessarily apply in other disciplines. So yes, there's some things that cross over, but into medicine, for example, or nursing, but there is some elements of paramedic practice that are specific to paramedicine. Another characteristic of a profession is that they have technical and moral authority over their skill set, over their discipline. And what this means is that not only do they have an expertise in their particular area and a unique expertise, but that they have also some moral authority over that, which means it gives them power. They have the power to say to government, for example, look, if you want a particular service provided in the pre-hospital care space, then paramedics are the people to provide that care and that service, because we're trained to do so in that very particular area. We have those skills and expertise. So if you were to think about, for example, recently in the news about pill testing, you would think that the experts in terms of the provision of care to people at music festivals who may or may not be taking drugs is to be provided by paramedics. That is their domain of expertise, that pre-hospital, out of hospital care space. So they have the technical and moral authority that is recognised by government, for example, that gives them power to operate in a particular way in a particular space. They also have the capacity to gain and maintain control over their own work. That is a characteristic of a profession. And paramedics until last year did not have control over their own work. Their control was managed by their employer, usually the state-based ambulance services. But once they got regulated by the Health Practitioner Regulation National Law Act, and which established the Paramedicine Board of Australia, now paramedics are registered and regulated by their own people. So the paramedics regulate paramedics. The Paramedicine Board of Australia is full of paramedics, and they regulate other paramedics. So now, for the very first time in Australia, paramedics maintain control over their own work, which is a sign of a profession. And finally, there's regulation by professionalism, and this is what distinguishes professions from non-professions, that they are regulated by a code of ethics, that they have an obligation to act in their patient's best interest that goes beyond just a business transaction requirement. So the question you can now answer is, how is being a paramedic different from being a plumber in terms of your professional status? Because you could say that a plumber has a unique purpose, they perform a unique task, they have specialised knowledge and skills, they have technical authority over their discipline area, and they have control over their own work. Plumbers are their own bosses, after all. But what they don't have, what distinguishes them from paramedics, is that they're not regulated by professionalism, that they don't have to act in their client's best interests as defined by their own profession. They can, but they don't have to, whereas paramedics are obliged to, or there are consequences. Okay, so in ascertaining what the characteristics of a profession are and establishing that, do we think, therefore, if we go back a slide, that paramedics are, if we were to go back here, would paramedics be considered a profession alongside teachers, doctors, judges? What do you think, now that you know what the definition is, what the characteristics are? Arguably, yes. Arguably, we're in the position now where we can say that we're a profession because we have all of these skills. We're all these characteristics. We're at this point now where, in terms of professionalism, the Paramedicine Board of Australia is in the implementation stage of establishing a culture, an ethos of ethical practice, and that is the final step in the development of the profession as a profession. So, professionalisation is the term that we use to describe the way in which occupations move through a change from a non-profession to a profession. And what we would say is that once upon a time, paramedics were not a profession, that they were a vocation, that they were seen as stretcher bearers or ambulance drivers, that they weren't seen as healthcare professionals who worked autonomously with a discrete set of knowledge and skills, that had moral authority, that was coming from a highly educated background, that was able to act with professionalism, and indeed required to act with professionalism in their practice. So paramedics have moved through a process of professionalisation over time. And the steps they have gone through in order to professionalise include these steps, which are recognised by sociologists as being steps that are common to groups who become professional. They shift their education from training schools to university. The development of the group goes beyond just local associations of people to a national association representing the group, and they become regulated by the state. Then finally, the final step is often to develop a code of conduct. And this is where paramedicine is right now. So it's shifted over time. We're about to go through the history of education from first aid training, basic first aid training, into training schools specifically designed for paramedics, and then off to university where you are now, which is now a requirement. They have moved from just local associations of ambulance officers to two national associations actually. They are now regulated, as I've mentioned, by the Health Practitioner Regulation National Law Act as professionals, so they're regulated to practice with professionalism. And the Paramedicine Board is in the process of developing a code of conduct that represents the profession and the paramedic identity and the unique work that we do and the way in which we think we should do it as a group. All right, so where did paramedicine come from? Well, forever. There have been people who have cared for others in the community, obviously, but what we would say is that a formal group of people who put their hand up just to transport people from home to hospital or from the street to hospital is this group, the Brothers of the Compagnia della Misericordia in Italy, Florence in Italy. And this group got together originally in around 1240 AD. And this is thought to be the first formal, what we would call, ambulance service. The Benedictine monks had developed an infirmary within monasteries in Europe around the 6th to 10th century in terms of, hospital development. But people were otherwise cared for at home. But what was missing was this formal transportation service that got people from home to the hospital or from the streets into the hospital. And so this group of actually wool porters by day, so their day job was to carry big rolls of wool around Florence. They're very strong men. That's partly why they thought they were capable of doing this task, which was carrying other people to hospital, because they carried that weight in wool around the city of Florence. But they felt like they had a particular social obligation and duty to provide this care as brothers of the Company of Mercy to their local communities. And so they took on the task of removing fevered and dead patients to a hospital, and they felt like they had actually that they were compelled to do this. They were compelled to to provide this public service, they were compelled to attend to any emergency that occurred and offer assistance. So this is arguably where we start to see the first formal ambulance service. They developed an ethical code to their practice, and part of that, each member of the service was required to take an oath. So much like you may hear of the Hippocratic Oath in medicine, these brothers of mercy would take an oath, and that oath would, they would say that they would respond to their houses or to the hospital all those who may be taken with sudden illness or who fall from scaffolding or otherwise be grievously injured in our streets and stand in need of their fellow creatures' assistance. And we will also carry to the churches the bodies of such as may fall down dead or be slain or be drowned. So this was first recorded as happening in, like I said, in 1240, but it's more formally recorded 600 years later in 1826 in a journal that looked at the history of the Brothers of Mercy and where they came from and what their role was. So they maintained this role throughout that time of providing this key service. The brothers would respond when a town bell was rung. A number of men would arrive at a scene with a litter ready to pick up and carry the injured person to hospital, and if the patient was to remain at home, the brothers would perform every office of the kindest nurses at the bedside of the sick. So what that tells us is not only did they provide a transport service, but they also provided succour and care for those who required it beyond just the transport element. And this is really where we see the beginnings of ambulance professionalism. One report detailing the response of the brothers to a woman who had fallen and broken her leg said this: "The litter, a covered one, was placed on the ground by her side. Then, without a word, but with the utmost attention and gentleness, they placed her within it, and immediately it was raised again on their shoulders. One of the brothers asked her some question in a whisper, and she replied that she felt no pain, but was very faint, and they immediately bore her to hospital with a tender regard for the ease and comfort of this poor woman, that showed the brother to me in another light, and I was rejoiced to see that their kindness was equal to their heroism." So paramedicine really, at its beginnings, as a formal or organised response to help within the community, started from a very important altruistic focus, and that is a focus on looking after the care of others, beyond oneself. That's what altruism means. It means a selfless concern for the well-being of others. And this is very clearly demonstrated by the oath that the brothers took and the way in which they behaved, which is what we expect of professionals today. In addition to their altruism, you could see in the photos before that the brothers wore black and they wore a hood and they disguised their faces, and this was very deliberate. This was a type of uniform, and it was designed actually to separate them from their personal vanity. It was to remove any individuality, to remove any identity, and instead to sort of rule out any personal interest and promote the public interest ahead of the individual. So it was to make them all look uniform and the same, so they could focus on providing benevolence to their community. It was to encourage humility, to put their patients first. And they said about that, there were no anniversary dinners, there were no toasts and sentiments, no blazing accounts in the newspapers of their activity or heroism and charity. All goes on quietly and modestly. The brothers know how much they are beloved and are content without a display of their influence. So they were humble, They were altruistic. They put the interests of others first before themselves. And what I want you to reflect on with regards to that is just what you see in the media today with regards to paramedicine, and whether you think we still do the same thing today, or whether you think there are paramedics out there who do promote themselves, do promote the profession in a way that perhaps isn't consistent with the way in which the brothers performed this work and developed this formal role in the first place all those years ago. So after the Brotherhood of Mercy really sort of established formal paramedicine, it then really started to develop further and take off during wartime. The Active and Organised Pre-Hospital Care Provision and Transportation Service was established a very long time ago. There are references in the literature to mobile field hospitals being used in wartime that were called ambulancia by Queen Isabella of Spain. It's not what we think of as an ambulance today. It was a whole hospital. We now think of an ambulance as being a vehicle. But this is first recorded in around 1487. In the early 19th century, a French physician called Dr. Dominique Jean Larrey recognise the importance of having a vehicle of some sort available on battlefields to remove injured soldiers off the battlefield and transporting them to definitive care where there are doctors and nurses in the hospital as quickly as possible away from the action. And so he developed this flying ambulance, which you can see here on the left, which was really just a tube long enough to put a patient in and get them to travel to hospital. And it's not dissimilar from this version here. You can see the stretcher goes in and then off they go. There was no room for a paramedic, an ambulance officer, to sit and provide care en route to the hospital as there is now. It was only a tube-like structure, which was long and narrow and able to take the patient only, not a carer. And you can see how this is a very quick evolution of the ambulance over time. But so we've gone from this tube-like structure where the the patient goes in lying down and there's no care provided, to something a little bit bigger that allows someone to sit in the back with the patient, and that has sort of remained the same. In the 1960s, something went horribly wrong in America and things went flatter, but they're now almost universally, you will see ambulances around the world look like this shape. It's a very unique shape. It's a specific shape designed to perform a specific purpose, which all goes to the unique purpose and role that paramedics play in our society, particularly those who work in ambulances, which is one of our key tools of practice. So during the Crimean War, around the mid-1800s, ambulance soldiers were the first formally noted workers to be exclusively associated with ambulances. Their role was distinct from other workers. So they had to not only retrieve and transport injured soldiers to hospital, they had to look after the horses and the carriages that carried them. So they had to develop unique skills like looking after the horses, looking after the animal husbandry, as well as being brave enough to go out and get people off the battlefield and transport them to hospital. Now this is a picture of a Nightingale ward, and for those of you who are familiar with Florence Nightingale, a very famous nurse, she was first rose to prominence during the Crimean War, where she introduced new ways of doing things that resulted in better outcomes for patients. So she, for example, introduced cleanliness. She introduced care, comfort, hygiene, and nutrition to injured soldiers, and recognised that all of those things matter beyond just what the surgeons were doing, which was amputating limbs, for example. So beyond just what doctors did, which was those sort of mechanical attempts to sort of cure a patient of his ill. So if he had his leg shattered into 100 pieces by some sort of ammunition, then it had to be amputated in order to prevent gangrene from developing. But then Florence Nightingale realised, well, that's just not the end of the process. We can't just cure the patient of that potential ill. Now we actually need to provide care for the patient in order for them to recover well and be as well and healthy as they can be, as soon as they can be. So where we would describe sort of medicine as being curative in its nature and structure early on, nursing offered care, and they're the distinct discipline. That's the distinction in the disciplines between medicine and nursing, typically, where it's historically come from. So that's why I mentioned that. So the ambulance soldiers would pick up the injured workers off the battlefield, load them into the ambulances and transport them to hospital where they would be operated on by doctors and then cared for by nurses. This is the type of ambulance that was used in the Crimean War. You can see now it's much bigger and broader and offers multiple transportation for multiple patients, beyond just the single tube that had existed previously. And this is part of the development of the profession as well. What also happened during the Crimean War is that there was actually a parliamentary inquiry in England about, what went right and what went wrong in terms of their response, the English government's response to the war. And what was identified, actually, which is interesting, is that a very unique problem with the ambulance officers. So what was recognised was that the British government had failed to provide sufficient numbers of ambulance resources in the campaign, in the early part of the campaign. And this was said to have contributed to significant losses of life, because there was a delay in collecting the wounded and dressing their wounds and getting them to definitive care. So the English parliamentary inquiry, for the very first time in a formal sense, identified the very important and unique role of ambulance officers, and that they actually, that role could be life-saving. So this was sort of the first time formally that this is acknowledged by a government, by power. Unfortunately, though, the ambulance officers were also criticised. The ambulance soldiers, as they were called then, were all criticised for their lack of professionalism. So what happened, these particular soldiers were often recruited from very poor backgrounds. They'd been forced into the army by starvation and unemployment and poverty, and occasionally as an alternative to prison. And so what this meant was that, unfortunately, in terms of their professionalism and their ability to act with professionalism in their roles, it was said to be lower, because of the cultural background, the class background in which the workers had come from. So there was lots of drinking by ambulance soldiers, and B.W. Marlowe, who was a surgeon for the 28th Regiment, wrote in his submission to this parliamentary inquiry on Crimea that the men of the ambulance corps can scarcely ever be depended upon. They are insubordinate, disobedient, and so perpetually drunk and noisy as to have become a public nuisance. So not only were they not useful, they were less than useful. They were worse than useful, because people were paying attention to them and looking after them when they should have been looking after soldiers. However, it was noticed by the British medical establishment at Crimea that the French had a really fantastic ambulance corps, that they were noted, the ambulance corps, the French corps, were active, they were trained and educated. And this was the first time this language had been used about ambulance officers. And it was recommended to the inquiry that the British would benefit greatly from adopting a similar approach to the French to this particular section of their workforce, that the ambulance officers that the whole army, in fact everyone, would be better off if the ambulance corps were trained and educated in their particular role, and with the importance of professionalism. It was recommended to the inquiry that the role of the ambulance attendant also expand beyond just transporting and looking after the horses, to providing some ability to educate the staff to actually assess patients and provide care to injured soldiers. So this is really the first time, this is a particularly important point in the professional development of paramedics, that now they were recognised as being so important and so intrinsic in that care and that unique role that they provide, that they should be properly trained in order to provide it. So that's bringing in the education element that we mentioned earlier on, unique purpose and unique knowledge and skills. After the war, around the same time in the mid 1800s, there was, of course, the Industrial Revolution going full bore in London. And what was noted there was with the rise of industrial or factories, for example, there was a rise in workplace injuries that were similar in nature to the traumatic injuries that have been seen on the battlefield. So again, there was this unique role out of hospital. Care and treatment was required to be provided, or at very least transport from the factories to the hospitals to care for these workers. They were oftentimes children, as you can see in that picture on the right. These children were often had small enough fingers to be able to get into the intricate machinery. Unfortunately, it meant they often suffered injuries like damaged fingers, amputated fingers, and so on and so forth, and arms that required treatment. There was also at the same time an outbreak of cholera in London, which you may have heard about, with John Snow discovering that at this time there was no germ theory. We didn't really understand the notion of bacteria and viruses. Up until this point, we just understood disease to be transmitted by miasma, or like a cloud. But John Snow was an early epidemiologist, a doctor who recognised that all the people who were sick from cholera happened to live around a particular pump, the Broad Street pump in London. So he shut the pump down, and when he shut the pump down, the cases of cholera stopped. And so it was the first time that there was a recognition that maybe the water was contaminated, that it wasn't miasma, it wasn't the air per se, it was the water itself that was contaminated with cholera, and that in order for it to be safe to drink, people should either not drink it at all, or boil the water before they drink it. So anyway, it meant that London at this time was dirty and diseased, and there was a obvious role for ambulance, an urban ambulance service to be established here. So no no longer restricted to just the battlefields of war, but rather bringing it into the urban space and creating a civilian ambulance service, much like the Brotherhood of Mercy in Florence, but now in this new industrial age and space. So at first, public cabs were used as transport for the injured and diseased in London, but it was recognised that that wasn't really suitable, and fire services were considered an alternative, but they really didn't have adequate transportation space. You know, there were a variety of different vehicles used, policing was used, there were a variety of different vehicles used, but ultimately it was recognised that there was a need for a formal organised urban ambulance service to play an important and unique public health role in society. So this is the first time we start to see this as well. By the way, this is also happening in America at much the same time in much the same way. It's quite universal. So the ambulances, the first ambulance wagons resembled cabs, and so the authorities were invited to mark them with the word ambulance in big conspicuous letters down the side to differentiate them from cabs. And although sick people could still take a cab to hospital, it became an offence under law to transport a non-infectious person in a cab unless the cab had been adequately disinfected first. Now, obviously, the problem with this is that the cab drivers were then required by law to undertake a task as A, identifying who was infectious and who wasn't, and then B, disinfecting their cab. And so this again led to this discussion, led predominantly in the Lancet, by the way, by the medical fraternity, to say, look, cab drivers are not pathologists. They're not able to make this distinction. So we need adequately trained people with a specific vehicle designed fit for purpose that can perform this task. And that's what led to the development of specific vehicles called ambulances and labelled as such. to perform this role, and it also led to the more formal training of staff, which was undertaken by the Order of St. John. So this is the first aid training. The Order of St. John commenced instructing individuals who did not belong to the medical profession for the first time in ways of tending and relieving persons injured by accident in a time of peace. So this is the first civilian first aid training. This wasn't at war. This wasn't on the battlefield. It wasn't to medical professionals, doctors and nurses. This was to non-doctors and nurses in a civilian space, so that they could provide care to people injured in an accident in an urban environment. The principles that informed the provision of care included the preservation of life, the prevention of further harm, and the promotion of recovery. And they're the key elements that really apply to paramedicine even today, which is to try to preserve life, to prevent further harm, and to promote recovery for our patients. The training manual that was used was titled First Aid to the Injured. It was written by a Surgeon Major, Dr. John Shepherd, and delivered by him, the lessons and nurses. By 1879, the London Metropolitan Asylums Board had centralised an ambulance communication system that allowed for an ambulance to be responded to those who needed it, with a nurse in the back as a carer and a driver as a patient. To a patient, sorry, not as a patient. Ambulances were modified to meet their unique requirements over time, including one ambulance, for example, developed a specifically constructed ventilation shaft that was treated with a germicide solution, and that was built into the patient safety fever van, as it was called, which is quite a long name for infectious disease. But the significance of that is that we're talking about very specific vehicle design, designed for a very specific purpose, and that's the unique purpose and role that paramedicine was playing at that time. Now, this symbol, by the way, is the Maltese cross, and you can see it's got 8 points, and that is a symbol that you will still see on ambulance service uniforms today, for example, New South Wales Ambulance. And so what I would ask you to do is stop and reflect on what the 8 points mean, and how do they relate to professionalism and the role of paramedicine, and a code, if you will. What does it mean? What's the significance of it? If you're going to wear it, you should probably understand what it means. If you wear symbols, you should understand what they mean. So what about Australia? Well, in Australia, an ambulance service was first established by the Board of Health in Sydney in 1881 to transport infectious patients to hospital. The ambulance corps were required to not only transport patients but to fumigate and cleanse houses, bedding and other household items believed to be contaminated with disease. Staff were supplied with disinfectants, hammocks, tarpaulins, oilcloths and materia medica, which means substances used for healing. So this is the first time you see, again, ambulance officers in Australia with a specific role, a specific tools and equipment to perform that role in a very unique way. So by 1915, staff were they'd advanced their skills and were able to assess and treat fractures, dislocations and sprains, treat hemorrhage and wounds, assess foreign bodies in the eyes, nose and ears, treat bruises, burns, and bites and stings, assess insensibility and poisoning, and perform artificial respiration. So the advancement in their skills and knowledge and practice and scope of practice was quite significant from the battlefields of Crimea, for example. In about 50 years, 60 years, they'd really advanced very significantly, and that was with the help of St. John and training by St. John doctors. We also saw an increase, so this is around the time of World War I, of course, 1915, where we sort of see some heroes emerging in the discipline as well. So you would all be familiar with John Simpson, the legend of John Simpson and his donkey at Gallipoli, and he is, for example, an army medic who was altruistic in his actions, that he risked his own life and, in fact, sacrificed his own very young life for in order to help others on the war zone, in the war zone at Gallipoli. And this is where we first start to see some of our heroes, our first heroes in our profession as well. So it would be wrong to think that there isn't a long history, long and proud history of heroes and altruism and professional development in paramedicine, just as has been in nursing with Florence Nightingale, or medicine with Hippocrates and the Hippocratic Oath and the like. Paramedicine can carve out its own unique role and purpose that it has performed for a very long time and has grown and developed over time, and we should celebrate that a little bit more. So over time, the call for ambulance services grew, but the role didn't really extend much beyond what I just said it was in 1915, which is all that first aid stuff. But nonetheless, services were mainly provided by volunteers, and they provided first aid plus transport. So it wasn't just first aid, it was first aid plus transport. Most services, ambulance services, raised money for supplies through community fundraising, and they were well supported by the communities. The community valued the role that they played, and that's another really important and significant thing to know about paramedicine, is that the community has always been very supportive of the unique role and important role that the community that they play in the community. The reason why this is important is because as professionals and when you're asked to act with professionalism, it is in some part in order to preserve the professional status of the profession and in the enjoyment of that trust and status that the community has placed on us. We are often referred to as the most trusted profession because of our reputation for putting our patients' interests first and really being prepared to run towards danger when others run from it, and those sorts of things, and this proud history and this association with medics working like John Simpson did. So we need to be very mindful of our professional reputation and do what we can individually to help uphold it. The first, around 1919, we first saw the first ambulance law in Australia. It was called the Ambulance Transport Services Act in New South Wales in 1919, and this was the first time the ambulance was separated from the hospital. It gave control, independent control, to the ambulance services to the Health Minister, and it helped again recognise them individually apart from the hospital and apart from doctors and nurses. In 1921, the New South Wales Ambulance Transport Service Board attended about 12,000 cases, and like I mentioned, enjoyed a very high status in the community, often being referred to as angels of mercy, that got them beyond just the status of being mere ambulance drivers. We also developed around this time qualifications. So the drivers of ambulances were male and the treating staff were mainly female nurses. However, this was slowly starting to change, and in 1892 in Brisbane, the St John Ambulance First Aid Certificate became the minimum qualification required for all its ambulance officers, and staff were also paid. So we're seeing a shift here in around the turn of the century. 20th century, ambulance officers were now required to be trained, and they were required to be professionals, that is, not amateurs. They were not volunteering their services, they were actually getting paid to perform this role. So this is quite a significant development in the profession as well. The purpose of the ambulance service was to treat and transport persons suffering from any form of sickness or disease, and by the mid-1930s, New South Wales ambulance officers were referred to as highly trained staff delivering a humanitarian service to the standard that was second to none in the world. So the status of ambulance officers and the status of the paramedic service, the ambulance service, had really risen fairly rapidly from just being stretcher bearers in Crimea to professional, highly trained staff performing humanitarian tasks, and to a level that was second to none in the world by less than 100 years later, by about 80 years later. So that's a really rapid progression for the profession. By 1953, the New South Wales Service had grown to the point where it claimed it could reach every home in the state. Um, it some people, some ambulance officers were still referred to as drivers or bearers, or collectors, because they would collect subscription fees for their services. But nonetheless, it was recognised that um, ambulance officers were starting to really develop a body of knowledge and skills of their own, and perform tasks that were distinct from those of doctors and nurses. So in 1957, it was recognised that ambulance officers required their own training school, and they were trained to a defined standard. And in 1961, the first ambulance officers training course commenced in Geelong, with care instruction from doctors and nurses and driving instruction from ambulance superintendents. So by the 1960s, we had our own training school. During the 1960s and 70s, there was a rapid progress in radical advances in medical knowledge and technology. So you can see, for example, here on the left is a picture of a car, a very old car from the 70s, and this is a car from 2016. And what's distinct about this is you can see in this car that the entire cabin area where the dummy is, where the driver would be, is completely crushed in. It's basically in the back seat. Whereas by 2016, we developed a whole lot of safety features, which meant that there's an airbag, for example, and the entire cabin in which the passengers and driver sit is completely protected from impact. In the 1970s, we didn't have seat belts, so people would go through windscreens. We had steel cars that the laws of physics meant that all the we didn't have a concertina effect in terms of it, the front of the car absorbing all the impact in a concertinaed way. All that impact went through a human body and could kill people. So we didn't have seatbelts, we didn't have drink driving laws, we had very unsafe vehicles, and we had high rates of vehicle ownership in Australia. So car trauma, car accidents was a major problem during the 1960s and 70s. But in the US, there was a lot of work going on to try to help deal with this because of the huge amount of trauma that paramedics were being exposed to. Dr. R.A. Cowley, a US-based doctor, developed a concept referred to as the golden hour, where he claimed that trauma patients who received definitive care within an hour of injury had significantly better outcomes than those who did not. And this was a really formative, really seminal piece of work that went on to really influence and shape the way in which paramedic services were funded, and the way in which we were trained, and the way in which we developed. And so this kind of research really led the development of the profession in a unique way, because we paramedics were the ones out there working in that golden hour to try and get people out of cars and get them off to hospital within that tight time frame. So Cowley's theory had a massive impact on the shape and relevance of pre-hospital trauma care. There was a quantum leap then from sort of the 50s into the 60s and 70s, where the theory was picked up and applied in Australia. It led to a quantum leap in the skills of ambulance officers and took them beyond basic first training to advanced life support, which was taught to them by doctors. So previously, skills that had only been able to be used by doctors in hospital are now being taught to paramedics to apply out in the field before they got to hospital. There was a lot of information coming back from the Korean War and the Vietnam War during this time about how to deal with trauma that was also being utilised. There was the establishment of the Ambulance Services Advisory Committee to facilitate the clinical and professional development of paramedicine, which was now being recognised as being really important. We had things like the Grenfell train disaster in New South Wales, which really highlighted the importance of the role of paramedics as unique healthcare professionals working in a unique space. And so what we saw there then was this really rapid increase in knowledge and skills for paramedics that we hadn't seen for about 70 or 60 years. So we had, within 4 years, we had Victorian paramedics had gone from providing basic first aid to advanced life support skills. And they were using treatments that were only previously used by doctors, now being used by them, including things like anesthetic agents, for example. So, a really, really rapid rise in skills and knowledge and responsibilities for staff around the 1970s. In late 1969 and 70, we saw the establishment of a professional association, which is the Institute of Ambulance Officers, was first formed. It later became the Australian College of Ambulance Professionals, and that is now Paramedics Australasia and ANZCP, Australian and New Zealand College of Paramedicine. So these professional associations have gone from being local associations, firstly, off now to being established as national professional associations, whose role was to develop and maintain the best practice of professional practice for paramedics, and to facilitate and promote quality training, outreach, research, and monitoring of standards of paramedicine. So although paramedics weren't regulated by the state at this point, formally, they were being monitored and regulating themselves through these professional associations. So the associations were absolutely essential for the professional development of paramedicine. So from about the 70s onwards, the paramedic professional development really picked up steam. And in terms of getting paramedics registered, the professionalisation project that was undertaken by Paramedics Australasia really began around 2007 and resulted in paramedics becoming registered in 2017, pretty much part of the national scheme. It took 10 years for that to happen, and that's a really big step forward for paramedics and professional development. So these things take time, but they require all these steps to sort of step through first in order to come out the other side with what we can see as professional paramedics today. The other big relevant medical development for paramedics beyond trauma in the 1960s and 70s was development in the area of cardiology. So cardiac disease was another big killer, still a major killer in our society, but apart from road trauma, the other big thing that paramedics would attend were heart attacks, because those cardiac events commonly happen outside of hospital. So we would be the first ones called to that. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation developed in the 60s, as did portable defibrillators, ECG monitors, and research into various pharmaceuticals like anginine. And all of those things helped change the work that paramedicine did and the way they did it. In addition, we had in New South Wales, for example, Kerry Packer here, who you would all have heard of, Australian billionaire who had a heart attack and was revived by paramedics, then offered to donate a huge number of heart start defibrillators to all ambulances in New South Wales, or subsidise them for the government, in order to ensure that all members of the public had access to these defibrillators, and this really helped improve outcomes for patients suffering from cardiac failure when they were available in fairly rapid response times. So around this time in the 70s, Victorian paramedics started to medical practitioners. There wasn't a discrete emergency medical discipline at that time. That was also new. It was evolving and developing, and those clinicians, those medical practitioners who thought, look, emergency medicine is actually a thing. This is really its own discipline. We think we should share our knowledge with paramedics because they're out there providing this emergency care. That's the nature of the work they do. So some doctors, including Frank Archer, who's a really leading proponent of this. Dr. Frank Archer really developed some programs, emergency medical programs that could be provided by paramedics. And in Victoria, those paramedics selected for these advanced skills and knowledge undertook a 3-month trial to see if they were capable of being trained and operating at this high level. The trial was successful, and that's where we first saw the first intensive care paramedics. So no longer just paramedics providing, basic first aid or advanced first aid. Now we had intensive care paramedics providing advanced first aid and beyond. Now, in order for them to continue to provide that care, we needed to give them higher knowledge and skills, and so we saw a more formal level of training start to take place, and the first course designed specifically for ambulance officers in TAFE commenced. It was the Certificate of Applied Science Ambulance Officer, and this was the first time that this was developed and applied. It was developed by the doctors and ambulance officers to train staff in the unique work, skills and knowledge that ambulance officers were required to do. The Victorian model was then adopted by other states once it was recognised how successful it was. So like I mentioned, that also led to the development of mobile intensive care units, and you can see here what the ambulances, the micro ambulances, look like. First off, here you can see a doctor performing a sort of cardiac intervention in the back of the ambulance. It was big enough for 2 practitioners to work in the back of, and here's the original micas. Then we moved to the Ford F250s, for example, which we had in New South Wales as well. Then for some reason someone made this decision to go to a Holden. That was terrible. They were awful to work in. Nowadays we have these sprinters, for example, and we even have paramedics responding on a motorbike or in a car just to get to the scene and stabilise the patient and commence treatment, that's separate from transport. So this started to be the first time we saw intensive care paramedics responding to patients without an ambulance necessarily, that they were responding just to provide their advanced skills and knowledge and care and treatment because they could. Rather than waiting for a full ambulance to come and transport the patient. During the so that was the early 1970s that led to further changes in the size and shape of the ambulance. These MICAs, Mobile Intensive Care Ambulance is what it stands for. In order to be an intensive care paramedic, staff were required to train alongside doctors in hospital in the areas of cardiology, emergency medicine, coronary and intensive care wards before going out on the road in the back of the ambulances. The type of skills that these paramedics had were only otherwise performed by doctors and included things like intubation and cannulation. Initially, doctors worked beside paramedics, but as you can see here, but eventually paramedics protocols and procedures were developed that allowed paramedics to work without doctors. By 1975, New South Wales had begun trialling its intensive care model, and this was followed by Tasmania, South Australia, Queensland, Northern Territory and the ACT. It was so successful. By the 1990s, throughout the 80s, medical skills, knowledge and technology continued to grow, and the educational model of vocational education, that is TAFE-based training, just the skills-based training, just wasn't quite enough to keep up with the professional development of the profession. It was recognised that it should shift to tertiary education, where students could learn not only the skills but also theory that helped inform their practice and help them develop as a profession beyond just performing skills, and actually doing some critical thinking and working beyond protocols to guidelines, and applying elements of professionalism, making judgments about law and ethics and those types of non-clinical skills as well that are critical for a well-rounded professional to practice with professionalism. So CSU was Australia's first provider of a paramedicine service, which was established in a paramedicine degree. It was established in 1994. Victoria University developed a similar model the following year. So now, 25 years later, the paramedicine, the profession has been recognised as a profession with the establishment of the Paramedicine Board of Australia. under the Healthcare Practitioner Regulation National Law Act, alongside doctors, nurses, Chinese medical practitioners, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health practitioners, physios, dentists, chiropractors, and psychologists. And this is in part because of the work that paramedicine does today. So you can see here in this box in yellow the type of skills that paramedicine has, which is the fourth highest level of risky skills out of all the health professions. So paramedics put an instrument, a hand or finger into body cavities. They perform procedures below the dermis, the mucous membrane, in or below the surface of the cornea or teeth. They administer scheduled drugs and substances by injection. They supply substances for ingestion. They manage labour or the delivery of babies. They undertake psychological interviews and interventions to treat serious disorders with potential for harm for mentally ill patients. They're primary care practitioners who see patients with or without a referral from a registered practitioner. They treatment commonly occurs without others present, and the patients are commonly required to disrobe. So these are all recognised as risk factors that require a profession to really be strongly regulated, and this was the way in which paramedicine has been recognised as having developed today, is that it's one of the highest risk professions, health professions there is. And so it was kind of an anomaly that these other professions like Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander practitioners or chiropractors, for example, were regulated under the National Law Act, but that paramedics weren't. So it's good now that paramedics have been recognised as being required to be regulated, the same as these other professionals, and that we are recognised as being professionals, healthcare professionals, alongside our brothers and sisters in these other disciplines. So paramedic professionalisation has come through its 5 stages that were identified by Walensky, which we talked about right at the very beginning. It's emerged as a full-time occupation. It's established a training school which has moved to university. It's developed a professional association that's become national. It's got political agitation that's required it to be, that's led to it being regulated by the state under the National Law Act, and it has adopted a formal code of practice which you can read and are required to read for this subject, and it has been issued by the Paramedicine Board of Australia. So that would suggest that paramedicine has professionalised. So if we're a profession and we are professionals, part of a profession, what is it for us to act with professionalism then, and why is that necessary? Well, to act with professionalism is to act within a set of moral norms, principles, and standards of conduct and competency that's been set by your profession. And the kind of characteristics associated with healthcare professionalism include things like clinical excellence, altruism, the pursuit of patients' best interests, the sort of things I've been talking about, patient advocacy, advocating for your patient when they're not able to advocate for themselves because they're vulnerable, they're unconscious, they're just not able to, they're not well. Your job is to look after them and act in their best interests. You have high levels of technical knowledge, you have professional responsibilities, and you govern yourselves as paramedics. So these are all elements of professionalism, and these are all the types of characteristics that we hope you have developed and will develop by the time you leave here, and we expect you to develop, and your profession, more broadly the Paramedicine Board of Australia, expects you to develop. If you do not, there will be sanctions for that, and we'll be talking more about that next week in our lecture on regulation and what it means. So that's it essentially for this lecture. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask your tutors in your tutor groups. But that's a brief summary of the history of paramedicine. We've flown through the history of the 800-year history of paramedicine and hit on, discuss whether we're a profession or not, decided that we are, and that we now have a legal and moral requirement to act with professionalism, or what that means. Okay, that's it.